Hi there, Chris here. So today I'm going to show you how I will quilt my Hugs and Kisses baby blanket that I made in a previous video. For this quilt, I'm going to keep the quilting fairly simple, but I'll show you how I'm going to do it. So for today, obviously you'll need your quilt top. You'll also need your backing fabric that is about 2 to 3 inches larger on all sides than your quilt top. You'll also need some batting. I am using 100% cotton batting today. This also needs to be about an inch or two larger than your quilt top on all sides. You'll need some safety pins to pin it all together, or you can use spray basting if you have that and prefer. And today I'll be quilting with my walking foot. Rather than marking all of the lines individually, I'm going to be using painter's tape as my guide today. Today's quilt's pretty small, so I'm just going to do it on my cutting table. If your quilt is larger, you can do it on the floor also. So we'll start by taking our backing fabric and laying it face down on our surface. First, we'll start by finding the center of the backing fabric. So you can fold it in half this way. And then fold it in half again. And this corner is our center. So for now, I'm just going to stick a pin in that. And then we can unfold it. That's the back side of the pin. And that's going to be our center point to spread everything out. I have already found the center on my batting as well. So we will lay this on top and line those up. I'm going to take that pin out so it doesn't get stuck inside the quilt. And now we'll add our quilt top face up. This is the center. So I will line that up with the pin. I can feel it through all the batting. This doesn't have to be perfect. It's just really to help make sure that you have equal fabric available on all sides in your batting as well. With a smaller quilt, it's easier, but with a larger quilt, you might start at one end, and by the time you get to the other end, you're off. It could be frustrating, so this is just a little fail-safe. And now we can start pinning. Got my safety pins. You want to pin through all the layers. And pin about a hand's width apart. This is to keep everything from shifting while you're quilting so that you don't get any puckers in your quilt. Alright, now that I've got everything pinned, I'm going to flip it over and check the back side just to make sure there are no folds or any issues there. Oh, and I should take out that center pin. And now for marking the lines, I'm just going to be using some painter's tape, rather than using a ruler and drawing lines. I will be starting from the center-ish. So from this corner here, over to this corner here. What I will do is take one long piece of tape and just stick it down. Because all of these blocks are square, it makes it easy to follow along. And now I'll take it over to my machine and just stitch down one side, following it with the walking foot. So it'll be about a quarter of an inch away is where the stitching line is actually going to be, just the width of the walking foot. Once I make that line, I will lift this tape line it up with that stitching, and then stitch again on the other side of the tape, and complete the process until I get down to this corner. Then I will retape in the middle and start working my way up. Once I'm done with that, I'll repeat the process going from these two opposite corners so that we have a cross hatch over the entire quilt. So let's go over to the machine. Now that I have all of the lines quilted in this direction, I'll start in the opposite direction. As I'm stitching, I will put a little bit of tension this way, just so that I don't get any pleats where it divots there, because it will want to do that. Just the batting is fluffy, so I don't want it to end up folded over like that. So I'll just give it a little stretch as I'm stitching, just to make sure I don't get any tucks. And now that the quilting is complete, it's time to trim up the edges and bind it. So my preferred way to trim a quilt is to use a 12.5-inch ruler and just a rotary cutter, and then measure from this seam out. So these blocks are about 7 3/4. So what I will do is get to 7 3/4 and 7 3/4. Line that up here on the block and then trim the excess. Having a large square ruler really helps to get some nice crisp 90-degree corners. And then when you're going along the edges, just measure that same 7 3/4 and trim it off. And now we're ready for binding. So I found this lovely teal fabric for my binding, and I'll be using my 2.5-inch strip cutter from Quilt. So we will line that up, and then probably can't see it on camera, but you can see where the blades are. I'm going to go just a little beyond that and fold. This should give me enough binding. Luckily, it's a small quilt. Most important part is making sure that this is right along the 90 degrees so that there's no bend in the finished binding. Now we'll add our mat, send it through. Slide the mat off. We'll get rid of the ones that don't fit. And then over here, I believe this strip is going to be a little short, which means this strip also is a little short, which is fine. We still have enough for the full binding. These ones are full. Now I'm going to show you a trick that I learned on the AccuQuilt live events. If you don't watch those, you definitely should. They have lots of helpful information. but we're going to use the 4.5-inch half square triangle to put a 45-degree miter on these before we sew them. So what we will do is line them up so they are right along that bottom edge, not over it, but just barely on it. We'll line these all up. Remember, you can only do 6 layers, which I think is what I have here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, I only have 5. Okay. And then when you go to put your mat on for cutting, you don't want to cover this blade here because then you'll chop off your binding. So we're just going to cover this diagonal blade, just like that, and then send it through. And what that will do is perfectly trim your ends and cut off your dog ears. So as you're attaching them, you can actually line them up perfectly. And then sew your 1/4 inch from this point to this point. And then when you open it, it will be perfectly straight. All right, so we got this end done. Let's do the other end. This is the one that is not full, so we'll just make sure all that gets cut off. Put our mat on. Make sure not to cover that edge, just the diagonal. That might be a little... Oh, they fell right out. And now all of our binding pieces are ready to be sewn together. So we'll start with our first piece. Take our second piece and just line it up. And sew from corner to corner, right at a 1/4 inch. When you open it, it's perfectly straight. So now, since I am working with solid fabric, I just need to make sure that I am treating the right side the right way, so that when I'm winding my binding, I don't have some seam allowances on the back side and some on the front side. So this is the top, this is the good side. Get to this end and attach our next piece. And continue along. And then what I like to do is wind it onto an empty thread spool. So I'll just take some tape just to hold it to get started and wind it around. This just helps keep it tame while I'm sewing. And then as I get to those seams, I will finger press them open. That just helps reduce the amount of bulk that's in the binding. You're gonna end up with like 6 layers of fabric as you're attaching this to your quilt, so it's going to get bulky. So pressing those seams flat, I find, is really helpful in reducing a big bump in your binding. So I just finger press it flat, and then as I roll, it's gonna get caught in there and just help press it even flatter. Now we're ready to attach our binding. I've also prepared my label. I prefer to attach my labels at the same time as my binding so that it's not an extra chore I need to do later. There are many different methods for attaching binding. Today I'm going to keep it simple. We're going to attach it to the back side of the quilt, fold it to the front, and then top stitch it down. So first I'm going to find the corner that my label needs to go in. I put them in the bottom corner, and this would be on the bottom right hand when looking at the back. So this is the corner that it will go in. This quilt does have a direction since the hearts only go one way. And then what I will do is I will do a quick stitch around the 2 edges at about 1/8 of an inch, just to tack it in place so that it doesn't get bunched up when I do my binding. There we go. After the binding's done, I will come back and hand tack down these two edges. Since this is bulky, I'm going to put my walking foot back on to finish the binding. And now we can start with our binding. Make sure that any seams you have are going to be towards the inside. So if you have a solid color binding, just make sure you know which is the right side and which is the wrong side. And now you'll fold the binding in half and align the two raw edges of the binding with the raw edge of the quilt. When you start sewing, you want to leave a tail of probably 10 to 12 inches unsewn. So I will lay this down and start sewing, leaving that free. And we will still be sewing at 1/4 inch. As you approach the corners, you're going to want to stop 1/4 inch shy of that edge. And then with your needle down, pivot your quilt and sew 45 degrees off the edge. Just like that. Here you can see it a little more up close, so you do your 1/4 inch. When you get 1/4 inch to the edge, sew off. Then you'll take your unsewn tail and create a 45-degree crease right there. So this line, this edge of the binding, should be parallel with the edge of the quilt. And now you'll take all of that and fold it back so that it lines up with the edge of the quilt. And then we start sewing 1/4 inch all down this side. Coming up on another corner, so we'll stop 1/4 inch shy of that edge. And I'm talking about the edge of the quilt here, so you can feel it through the binding where that is. Pivot the quilt and sew to the corner. And then we just repeat. So we'll take the tail, fold it so that it runs parallel, and you'll have a 45-degree fold there, and fold it back on itself. And you want this edge to line up as well as this edge. And then just start sewing. Now, when you start to approach the area where you started, you need to stop and leave about 12 to 14 inches between where you're stitching and where you started stitching. So I will end this off here. So what you'll want to do is take your starting tail, lay it out, and then cut that about halfway. The easiest way to get a nice 90-degree cut is to fold it back on itself, line up the edges, and then cut along that crease. Now we're going to take this excess piece and lay it so that the raw edge lines up with the raw edge of the piece you just cut. Make sure your quilt is laid out flat, and then take the tail where you're ending, lay it down, and you're going to trim this one at the other end. And this works Regardless of what your binding size is, whether you cut at 2.5 inches, 2.25 inches, or anything else, using the scrap ensures that you have the proper distance between these two. Because what we will do now, take this piece without twisting it, lay it face up. And then this piece you are going to twist away from you and lay them together so they are right sides together. And I do suggest using some pins at this point. So you just line those corners up. Throw a pin in there to keep it all straight. And then another one over here. And then you're going to stitch from this corner to this corner here. It can get a little cumbersome, so you can fold up the actual quilt just to give you a little more slack in the binding. Go ahead and remove those pins. And then we're going to trim off this excess at 1/4 inch. It's already sewn, so you don't have to be exact. We're going to finger press this open. And now the binding is the perfect length to fit between where you started and stopped stitching. So now we can just stitch that down the rest of the way. Now we're going to take this over to the ironing board. So the first thing we're going to do is press all of the binding away from the quilt. In the corners, don't worry that it's not laying flat. So the important part really is just to press the crease where the binding and the quilt meet. Now that we've pressed all of the binding flat, we're going to flip the quilt over. And we're going to be glue basting it down. So I'm just going to use some Elmer's washable glue. Make sure it is washable, just the plain white glue. They also make quilt specific basting glue that has a really fine tip on the bottle that I've heard is really nice to be able to get consistent results. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to start in the middle of one of the sides and put down a little bit of glue. And then you're going to fold the binding so that it is just past your stitching line. And you want it to be consistent with how far you passed. So maybe like a 1/16 of an inch, just ever so slightly past. And you're going to press that down. The heat will dry the glue and hold your binding in place. Just like that. There are some spots, if you get a little heavy, where you'll see the glue. That will all wash out, which is why it's important to use the washable glue. For the corner, we'll continue pressing like normal. And you'll press it so that the line continues straight to the edge and you end up with a 45-degree fold in the corner. Once you have that pressed, then you will bring the next side down and you'll have a perfectly mitered corner. And now we can go back to the sewing machine. And now we're going to sew along and do a top stitch about a 1/16 of an inch to an 1/8 of an inch from this inside edge. I am going to pull all of my thread to the top just so that there's no chance it will make a nest underneath. And then just take your time and make a nice straight stitch. that, the quilt is complete. If you'd like to make your own Hugs and Kisses baby blanket, head on over to the AccuQuilt website where you can get the free download. Thanks for watching. See you next time.